Welcome everyone to the Tripolitan. My name is Yamak. Today we have a very special guest on the Tripolitan, Batir Kadkoy, who is a Circassian activist from the United States. He is the founder of the Voice of the Circassia podcast and accredited blogger. Also, he is a Circassian social media influencer who attempts to raise awareness about the Circassian cause and the Circassian peoples. Batir, thank you so much for being on today.
Hello, Sahlan. It's very nice to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Appreciate it, man. You know, uh, as I said in the trailer of this podcast when I first began, I always wanted to kind of target issues or peoples or just general causes that haven't been receiving the proper spotlight, in my opinion. And for me, is the Cherkasy or Circassian peoples have a special place in my heart. And to be honest, I found out something pretty recently as well. So I work in a company here in Dallas, and there's a lot of Jordanians here. And as you know, there's a huge Circassian population in Jordan. And when I entered, this is like my first day at work, and I introduced myself. There was a couple of Jordanian guys there, and they said, "Oh, your last name is Yamak. You're Sharkasi." And to be honest, I didn't really know much. I didn't know about the connection between the Yamak family and the Sharkas, but it seemed like the Yamak family has a historical connection to the Circassian people. So I don't know if you have any additional information about that, but it definitely was interesting to me.
Well, the Yamak family, it's an Arabized last name of the Yamich family. So in Cherkasy, we would call it Yamich.
Hmm.
But a lot of last names in the Arab world who from originally were Circassian ended up becoming Arabicized. So, for example, in my clan, I introduce myself as Kadkoy or Kadkoy among Americans or non-Circassians. But if I were to speak in my language, it'd be called Chadakwe. But because of linguistic difficulties, I just use the K as like the way the written is spelled. And it's the same way that, many other Arab clans or Circassian clans who live in the Arab world uh, introduce themselves. Clans in the Circassian families, when people think of Yemek, for example, it's similar to like how Arabs have like the Bani system. So Bani, Abadi, Bani this, Bani that.
Hmm.
Circassians kind of like have a similar clan structure. So in Jordan, the Yamich or the Yamak family is a pretty well established family. And in the homeland, in Adigea from the western side, they also have a significant presence there too.
That's like I said, I was fascinated when they just all of them at the same time. You know, the Jordanian guys at work, they just right away they said, "Oh, you're Sharkasi." And I started reading a little bit more about the Sharkasi people, and they have a very long and noble history, but also multiple tragedies, unfortunately, within their timeline. I wanted to just kind of start off with, just in general, who are the Circassian or Cherkasy people? Actually, another thing I wanted to kind of go into, should I refer to as Circassian or Cherkasy? What's the appropriate term?
I guess it's difficult. Sharkas is the proper term if you were to speaking in Arabic. But if you're speaking in, just in English, be it to Europeans or anyone else, could use the word Circassian or Circassian. I, due to my American accent, pronounce the things like Circassian.
Okay.
But whereas other people, they prefer to use the sh. It's really not big of a difference. I'm not one of those really nitpicky people where it says like, no, it has to be this or it has to be that. But I mean, it really just depends, especially to the audience, what term would be more, preferred to them. I think if, for the Arabic speakers who are listening in, Sharkasi is the same thing as Circassian. And, it's again, for our English speakers, Circassian is just the English word for Sharkasi in Arabic.
Great. Okay. All right. I'll stick with Circassian for now, I guess. So yeah, I guess back to my question. So who are the Circassian people, and where are they generally found historically and in the modern era? Where are they found?
So the Circassian people, they originate from the Northwest Caucasus Mountains. So for those listening in who have a sense of geography, that would be, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but from that mountain range on the opposite side, so the north. And those who are more familiar with the Islamic territories like Dagestan, Shishan, Ossetia, they'd be considered the Western territories adjacent to them. And for those who watched like the Olympics, such as the famous Sochi area, that Black Sea coast up until the Mount Elbrus mountain range is the historical homeland of the Circassian people, and they are a very old people. They've been there, with prehistoric settlements and archaeology that dates back up to 5,000, if not 6,000 years. We are considered one of the first and indigenous people to have lived there since antiquity. And, from our point, being situated between that mountain range between east and west, we've been in contact with many empires and many peoples, and we've always, been interacting. And ultimately, what led to the Circassian people being so spread out today is, when the Russian Empire under Tsar Catherine the Great began its invasion, due to a series of long conflicts, which, could be discussed later, the Circassian people ultimately lost, and as a deal with the Ottoman Empire, they were forced to leave their homeland and be settled into there. And from that point, the Circassians were dispersed into the Balkans, into Turkey, and to the Middle East today. And that's why most Circassian people, they are more normally found usually in the countries of Turkey, Syria, Jordan, the Holy Land, let's just say Israel, Palestine, depending on who it is. And there were, no longer existed, but there were, fragment communities in Lebanon and Iraq.
That's interesting. Yeah, as I mentioned before, especially in the Levant, there's a significant population of Circassian people. I wanted to ask, sometimes these terms get thrown around, like Circassian or even other ethnic groups, for example, like Kurds, and they're kind of portrayed as a monolith. Are there any intricacies within the Circassian peoples that is noteworthy? If you could just kind of touch upon that.
I think the best way to describe it is while there are many minorities that live in the Middle East, Kurds, Assyrians, Syriacs, Shabaks, Chechens, Dagestans, Ingush, Circassian people are their own territory.
Hmm.
So while in Arabic people often misuse the word Sharakas, the word Sharakas just literally refers to someone who's from the Caucasus. And so that could mean anybody from Circassians to Chechens to Ossetians to Dagestan to as I mentioned Shishan again, even Abkhazians. And these people, even though we're all related and neighborly to each other, we are distinctly different. We have different roots of origin. We have different, deep level traditions. Our roots, our languages are extremely different and completely unintelligible to one another. So while, for example, in Jordan you do have Circassians and Shishanis, for example, or Chechens, there are major differences between the two. And as a result, while yeah, the clothes and some parts of the food and culture might be similar, for the most part, they are separate and distinct ethnic groups between each other.
And even the language, as you said, is very distinct from the Chechen to the Circassian
Oh,
language.
absolutely.
Okay.
The only group that the Circassian people can say they have some sort of relation to in terms of, linguistic and genetic origin are the Abkhazian people, also known as Abazas. They are found, Abkhazia is considered the breakaway territory of Georgia, which is again in that northwest Caucasus range.
Hmm.
The story is that both the Abkhazians and the Circassian ancestors were from the same people, and
Hmm.
due to many centuries, if not even more, of migrations and patterns, they ultimately began to fracture into different the ethnic groups that we see today.
Hmm.
So while the Abkhazian language and the Circassian language, for example, are not mutually unintelligible, just as how Latin has created the various cultures today would be the French, Spanish, and Italians, or the Germanic people, and so forth. It's the
Right.
same thing for the Northwest Caucasus. And that's why Abkhazians and Circassians, while they do share a lot of more common origin, they are also, distinct from one another. But if there's any group that, who are we related to in that entire world, the Abkhazians would literally be the only candidate.
Right. You know, a lot of these terms that you're bringing up, they kind of were brought to the spotlight, especially, during the Sochi Olympics, for example. There was numerous articles written about the historic homeland of the Circassians. And, the Sochi Olympics kind of brought that back to the spotlight, in addition to, if I recall, the 2008, I think it was the war on Georgia, the Russian-Georgian War, when you had as you mentioned, Abkhazia became a breakaway state, and South Ossetia. These names started coming back to the spotlight, and people were interested to learn more. So, this explanation that you gave was really useful for people to realize the differences between the peoples in the Caucasus.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, unfortunately, I spent my entire life saying, "What's your background?" When I say Circassian, they say, "Well, are you sarcastic?" Like, so believe me, I've been the reason why I do what I do every single day is my goal in life is one day I can go up to anybody I want in the world, and when I say I'm Circassian, I don't have to give a 5 minute history lecture.
Inshallah, that would be that. That sounds great, man. And by the way, could you tell us a little bit about your background as well? I know you mentioned you're Circassian, but your parents, are they both Circassian as well?
Yeah, so my father is a Circassian from Syria, originally in the Golan Heights or
Hmm.
Jolan. My mother is a Circassian from the homeland in the Caucasus mountain range. Ancestrally, the difference between my parents, and this is what makes me very interesting, is so Circassians are split between two big tribal groups, Eastern Circassians and Western Circassians. They are, for all intents and purposes, the same culturally, except linguistically, they do have some minor differences. But just as how, for example, Egyptian and Syrian and even Jordanian, for example, Arabic has different, nuances, the same rules apply in our culture. So my father is an Eastern Circassian called from a Kabardey tribe, and his ancestors were exiled from the homeland, and they settled in the city of Quneitra in the Jolan. And later on, after the 1967 war, they were forced to leave and settle into the capital city of Damascus. My mother, on the other hand, her ancestors were one of the few people who were fortunate enough to remain in the homeland. So all my mother's family and her ancestors grew up both after the war with the Tsars, during the Communist Revolution, the collapse of the Communist Revolution, and they're from the territory known as the modern day Republic of Adygea. So and she's from the Shapsug Western tribe, a very original Black Sea Circassian tribe. So I've always had this like half diaspora, half homeland, half Eastern, half Western roots,
Hmm.
and born and raised in the United States.
That's really interesting. Because it just shows that there are still Circassians still living in their original homelands near the Caucasus, near Sochi. That not everybody has been exiled under the Tsar. And honestly, for the next kind of questions, I want to divide it into two portions, if you would allow me. The first would be pre Catherine the Great, before the horrific genocide that occurred against the Circassians, and then we can talk about post that event, basically. But I know that the Circassians pre Catherine the Great, there's a long history, and I know that this would take hours and hours to discuss. But if you could just briefly go over the history of the Circassian people and especially their effect on the Muslim world, in a way that you can summarize it, that would be
So the
great.
best way to describe the prehistoric Circassian, the I would say, genocide Circassian people is
Hmm.
this. From, I would say, like the early centuries, so like the early from the 800s, 900s up until like the early medieval era, from like the 12th to the 5th, to like maybe the 15th, 14th century. The Circassian people mostly lived in a huge confederation kingdom with the Abkhazians included, and they all lived on the huge Black Sea coast up until the coast of Crimea, all the way to the south. And they were like all other nations at the time. They were an established, kingdom, nobility, cities, cultures, hierarchy. And then what happened is the Mongol invasion happened. So when the Mongols invaded, they destroyed that like big territory that existed, and the Circassians ended up scattering all throughout the northwest Caucasus mountain range. And that's what inadvertently led to the rise of the 12 Circassian tribes, or the 12 stars that you
Mm-hmm.
see on the flag. And their impact on the Muslim world really began to happen when the Circassian Mamelukes began to rise. Now, to be fair for the audience, Mamluks just refers to a military slave. It does not necessarily mean Circassians, but it includes Circassians. And throughout history, many ethnic groups, from Georgians, Armenians, Turkish, even Kurds, as well as obviously Circassian people, they've all come from this lineage. Now, for the Circassian people, what happened was, at first Tatars and Mongols, or mostly Tatars, would often kidnap Circassian children, and they would often sell them to the slave markets, or they would be sent to the Islamic world. And from the Islamic world, under the Islamic system of slavery, they would be educated, militarily trained, and raised, and then later on commanded a position in society. And as their, as their fame began to grow throughout the world, then the huge and their increased competence began to become renowned. More and more Circassian slaves began being shipped to the Middle East. And later on, what ended up happening was, because the Mamluk Circassians would, they receive such higher standards of living compared to those of the slave of those who from feudal low slaves or whatnot from the homeland.
Mm-hmm.
Many began coming voluntarily. And the biggest, as you said, this is a very long, lecture, but to keep the time short, the biggest impact that left from the Circassian people to the Arab world, or Islamic world even, was the Circassian Mamluk state of Egypt. You see, like the many empires at the time, Egypt used to import lots and lots of Circassian and Mamluk slaves, including the most famous Sultan Baybars and the Sultan Qaid Bey. And when they came here, what happened was, in the fallout of the Ayyubid dynasty. So after Salahuddin dies, and after the Jerusalem and most of the Crusader states have been taken back to the Muslims, the Circassian people, and like all the other political factions living in Egypt at the time, vied for control. And finally, the Circassian leader, Mamluk leader, took control of the Egypt Sultanate. And for there, Egypt for up to 300 years was ruled by Circassian Mamluk sultans. And these sultans and the warriors and clans that existed happened were because the Circassian people, Circassians, we are a very warrior culture. We've always been renowned for our, both genetic and cultural prowess in, fighting. When the Mongols invaded, the Middle East, and they sacked Baghdad, and they were setting their sights on Jerusalem, the Mamluk armies are what kicked them out of
Mm-hmm.
the Levant, and they were the first real Muslim army to lead the first counterattack against the huge Mongol horde at the time. And for many years, the Circassians in Egypt lived there until, as the Ottomans began to expand, an Ottoman general named Muhammad Ali Pasha
Mm-hmm.
was sent to deal with them. And then finally, he offered the Circassian Mamluk leaders at the time a chance for conciliation. So, inviting the Circassian leaders to his castle for a celebration of sorts, he told them to come unarmed, and because the Circassians are honor bound, they did not. But when the Mamluk leaders arrived, the Sultan Muhammad Ali Pasha's men quickly arrested them, killed them, and only one of them managed to escape from the entire massacre that had took place. And from this point on, the Circassians lost their political footnote in Egypt. Many of them stayed and integrated within Egyptian society, but a lot of other tribes ended up migrating to northern Sudan and Misrata, Libya, even, which is where Misrata even comes from. And to this day, if you go to Libya, you will find a tribe called the Bani Cherkasy tribe. But the origins of this Bani are Mamluk Circassians who fled Egypt, and the same thing in Sudan.
Honestly, man, you are great because you just went over like hundreds and hundreds of years of history in a matter of minutes.
It's
It's
not easy, but I've had a lot of practice.
honestly, man, when you look back, you mentioned, for example, the great Islamic personality Baybars, for example, Bibars. who till today you have a lot of people who name their kids after Bibars. Um, Really, Bibars and his army, when they fought the Mongols at the famous Ain Jalut battle, which was the first or one of the first, basically historic defeats of the Mongols in open battle. And after that, it was a pivotal moment in their decline. Not only did they really save the Muslim world, Bibars, who was a Circassian, he saved Africa, he saved Europe, he saved the rest of the civilized world. To be frank, against the Mongol onslaught that was happening. So it's just incredible to kind of look back and that you look at this region that it doesn't receive much spotlight, especially in among Muslims nowadays. They're pretty ignorant about the region, I would say, many of them. And then when you look back at history, these heroes that we read about, like Bebars, and you realize that he was a Circassian. Um, it's it's really incredible. And you look back at also the event that you mentioned, Muhammad Ali Basha, who was also an Albanian of Albanian heritage, and how you have Albanians and this power struggle against Circassians all happening in Egypt. Just an incredible mix of different peoples vying for power, and all under the auspices of the Ottoman Sultanate, and under caliphates, and just like I said, it's like a cocktail, man.
Unfortunately, this has been the story of the Middle Eastern politics since the collapse of the Rashidun, even. So
Yeah.
it's we're just drawn into the mix like many other groups throughout history. I think, my often favorite joke is the Abbasiyin. The Abbasids were the ones who even created the whole Mamluk ideology, where you would take in slaves and you treat them as, lifelong military servants.
Hmm.
At one point, there's a famous story that a group of Shiite Mamelukes
Hmm.
took power in Baghdad, but they put a Sunni Khalif in charge, and they reasoned that if we put a Shia Khalif in charge of the Abbasids, he can order his army to kill us if we disagrees. If we put a Sunni in there, we can, command him to do that. And this
Right.
whole intrigue of politics was one unfortunately, divided and left most of the marks in the Muslim world today, even.
100%. 100%, man. Um, like I said, just fascinating to look back, and to make note of the Circassian effect, especially on the Muslim world, and the importance of Muslims to kind of understand the Circassian role. I wanted to move on now to the second part of our question that we were kind of talking about, which is the role of Catherine the Great, the genocide, and what happened afterwards. Basically, if you can also summarize, those series of events up until the demise of the Soviet Union. Um, the floor is yours.
So, describing the Circassians both before and after the war, we just refer to it as the war, is a very, like you said, complicated. But the best simplistic way to state it is like this. The Circassians controlled the Caucasus mountain range, especially in the northern plains, a very agriculturally and mineral-rich area, and situated on the warm water Black Sea coast. Up until that point, the Russian Empire had no ports and territories that were warm year round at all. So as the Russians began to expand more, and they've tried, they engaged, I think the most famous story was Ivan the Terrible, one of the most famous Russian czars. When the Tatars began attacking the Circassians so bad, one Circassian prince, he gave his daughter to the Tsar of Russia's Ivan as a wife. One of Ivan the Terrible's wives was actually Circassian, and her relatives became very famous people in Circassian society. And upon that pretext, among many other things, the Russians always wanted to control the Caucasus. So in 1763, Catherine the Great began an aggressive military campaign to take it over. And through Catherine, as well as many other tsars and generals that went after her, they engaged in a series of conflicts to capture it. Now, the way they did it is like, okay, for the first 20 years, they focused on, like I said, the Eastern Circassian tribes, and they subjugated them. Then from the 1830s to 40s, there wasn't as much fighting. Then from the 1840s to the 1860s, that was considered the worst amount of fighting for the Circassians. That's where the real famous Circassian genocide comes from. You see, as the Russians kept taking over our territory, they burned, massive amounts of land. They killed lots of livestock. They sponsored famines. They massacred and pillaged, countless people. In fact, many often even say that the events that happened in the Caucasus is what inspired the Young Turks to pursue their policy. Let's just say, to be politically correct, against
Mhm.
the Armenian people.
Mhm.
And this policy was so brutal and bad that as the Circassians just kept constantly losing from this barbaric war, finally, at 1864, May 21st, after the Battle of Sochi of Qabada, the Russian Tsar gave an edict that any Circassian tribe who did not make peace, prior to that treaty, is to ultimately be exiled and deported from the homeland for good. And most of the tribes were Western Circassians because that time the war was focused on the Western, but there were also a lot of Central and Eastern Circassians, like my father's ancestors, who were among them. And from that point on, due to a deal they had with the Ottoman Empire, most of the Circassians were sent out and settled into the Balkans today, into modern day Kosovo, Bulgaria, Serbia, etc. And they lived there and they settled for about 10 to 20 years until the Russo-Turkish War happened, the war between the Ottomans and the Russians. And because the Russians, they won that war and they became so scared of the amount of refugees in the Balkans at the time, they said don't keep them here. One of the provisions of the treaty was Circassians cannot be settled into the Balkans, they have to be sent somewhere else. So from that point on, with the exception of small community leftover communities, most Circassians were again taken from the Middle East and sent to modern day Syria, Jordan, uh, modern day Palestine, as well as the fragment communities in Iraq. The rest were mostly settled and sent to Turkey, where they've lived ever since. But that's, created the difference between the homeland and the diaspora. In the homeland, the Circassians who managed to stay after the war, they were very small and few in number, and they were heavily picked on by the Tsar and the Cossacks at the time. And, fun fact, when people often see Cossack uniforms and they see the way they dance, I often say, why do they look like Circassians? In reality,
Yeah.
the Cossacks actually stole that from the Circassians. In fact, the
Wow.
Cossack word for their clothes in the Cossack Russian language, it's called Cherkeska, which comes from the word Cherkes, which as we know is Cherkes or Circassian. So, uh, so this is what it ultimately comes from. And that's the whole story behind it. But what happened later on is the Circassians stayed after the war, and then from that point on, they lived through the Soviet Union. During the Soviet Union, the communists believed in a more favorable policy for minorities. So from there, Circassians began to slowly receive some type of rights, autonomy, representation, cultural, development, and they formed the republics of Adygea, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Karachay-Cherkessk. And from that point on, the Circassians, for the most part, lived through pretty much what else most people lived through. They lived through the civil wars, the famines, they lived through World War II, they lived through the whole communist period that happened. And finally, when the collapse happened and the whole, 90s, the nationalism broke out, the Circassians, took advantage of this and they established their own first, not independent, but autonomous republic, the Republic of Adygea, Republic of Kabardino-Balkaria, and the Republic of Karachay-Cherkessk. And to this day, most Circassians in the homeland, numbered up to 1 million people now, this is where they live. It's one of the few regions in the world left where the Circassians can still speak their language freely, and that's where they've stayed ever since. In the Middle East, it's been different. The Circassians lived through the great fallouts of the Ottoman period. So in Turkey, they lived through the Ottoman times pretty well off. And then what happened was, as Ataturk came into power and created the nationalist Turkish state that exists today, changed dramatically for the Circassians. So while, during the Ottomans, the Circassians lived okay, and under the Tsars, the Circassians lived much worse, it shifted completely with the Soviet rule of Circassians being treated a bit more favorably and the Circassians of Turkey living worse. And what happened was, due to Ataturk's policies, Circassians and all ethnic minorities were not allowed to use their names. They could not speak the Circassian language. They couldn't even form any cultural organizations. They weren't allowed to be Circassian publicly, except in their homes and in their villages. And if they tried, many of them would be arrested, and even in the 70s were assassinated and killed by ultra-nationalist fanatics. And it really wasn't until the 2000s even that the Circassians, in Turkey have managed to actually get a sense of their culture and, regained a lot of the rights that they wanted to actually start learning and know about their culture again. In Syria, the story goes is that the Circassians went to the Jolan Heights and the north, where Manbij and Halab is, and they lived there for a very long time to serve as buffer zones. They fought heavily, with a lot of the revolting Druzi and a lot of the other, groups at the time. But as the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the Syrian Republic was formed, the Circassians became a huge part of the military establishment. And then when the Ba'ath Party took power in Syria, the Circassians, also experienced a lot of that, Arab nationalism that, affected the region at the time. And later on, what eventually happened when the first Ba'ath revolution happened, it didn't affect the Circassians too much. Most of them lived in the Jolan, as I said, that province of Quneitra. So they had their own towns and villages that were completely separate from the rest of like most of Syria. And for the most part, they were well respected and left alone. But what happened was when 1967 happened and Israel invaded and took over the Jolan Heights, most of the Circassians had to leave everything they had to behind, and they just became refugees for like the third time and ended up settling in Damascus and all its, neighboring provinces. And from there, they had to live through a lot of, like I said, the political instability that Syria was throughout time, especially when the whole Akhwan and all those craziness was going
In
on.
the 80s.
Yeah, especially during the 80s. And, through a lot of time and effort, the Circassians worked themselves up to become a respected part of the Syrian community. And from the 90s up until the Civil War, the Circassians were pretty respected, not as powerful, you can say, but they were a respected, integral part of the country. The most famous country what Circassians often think of is Jordan. And the reason why this happens is simple. When the Circassians left the Balkans, they were sent by a man named Mirza Pasha and a few others to settle in Jordan. And at the time, Jordan was mostly inhabited by Bedouin Arab tribes. They were not sedentary people. So the Circassians came in and set up the first modern, footprints of the city of Amman, of Jarash, of Zarqa, as well as a few other towns.
Wow.
And they lived there, since then. When the Hashemi under Sharif Hussein began to expand and they came here, they made a pact or a bayat with the Sharkas made a bayat with the Sharif Hussein, and the reason was when the Sharif Hussein says that we are the Hashimis, we are descendants of the Prophet Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and we wish to recreate this united Islamic kingdom. The Circassians in Jordan agreed to protect the king. And when the rival Jordanian tribes who did not support the Hashimis fought them, the Circassians actually protected and saved them. And this was written down by both British and American historians. And by Jordanian constitution, the royal family's protection is must be held by Circassian people. That's why in the palaces of Jordan, the Circassian guard is out there. And from this point on, the Circassian people in Jordan are dominant all over the military, the government, and are very well respected for that because they were one of the first people there. And throughout the many political difficulties that Jordan has went through, the Circassian people were there at the front, leading and navigating through it. In fact, we just lost one of Jordan's most first generals, General Omran Khamish. He was the founder of the Special Forces and founder of the paratrooper unit, and he was a Sherkas who passed away recently. So this is why we are so connected to the Jordanian kingdom. The other communities that exist, this isn't as much, but as I said, as the migrations went out, Circassians went to the communities of Kosovo, where in the Balkans, they went to northern Iraq, they went to some interacted in Lebanon and Palestine. In Palestine, two villages still exist today called Kafarkama and Rihaniya. These are Circassian communities that are proud, active. They've integrated very well despite the very complex political situation there. They are Muslim people and they can speak Hebrew, Arabic, Cherkassi, and English at times and have a very public presence internationally. In Iraq, however, again, due to the Ba'athi policy, especially under Saddam Hussein, the Circassians and other minorities at the time were forced to Arabize under those rules. And up until even recently, this is when we actually discovered that the Cherkess community had even presences in Iraq, and some of those descendants still live there. In Lebanon, from what I was told, most of them settled in the north, where, by Tripoli, because it's on the border of Syria and Turkey. And they had a few settlements and, populations there. But as very well, the Lebanese civil war happened and destroyed much of the country. So whatever happened to those communities ended up assimilating, mixing, fleeing to whatever. But, historically, there were Circassians in Lebanon, not many, but some families ended up settling there, and the descendants of those families now are mostly integrated with Lebanese society. So that is why your last name is often tied to the mainstream Circassian clan itself.
Hmm. No, it's
Whew.
just,
I hope I
dude.
got that all in one shot. It's not hard.
Yeah.
It's because like we don't have one country. We live in so many different
Yes.
countries.
Yes, and it's clear that each country, the Circassian community has their own unique history with that country as well. It's not just something you can just cover all in one, in a general way. But just for the sake of the audience, you mentioned the word bay'ah, which just means the Pledge of Allegiance, basically, when you were talking about the Circassians and Sharif Hussein, when they gave the bay'ah, which just means the Pledge of Allegiance. And going back to Lebanon, there's been this since, as you know, I'm originally from Tripoli, Lebanon. There has been some initiatives, honestly, from many people with Circassian heritage. There's a Facebook page, that's trying to gather as many people as possible and to connect with other Circassian communities in the Middle East and in the Balkans and Turkey. So there is this growing awareness and this kind of this thirst to understand their heritage and background. So it's slowly coming back after the Civil War, and they are really using the neighboring Circassian communities as a support, basically as a support system to better understand their past.
Yeah, I actually had the fortune. I'm gonna give a shout out here because she deserves it. I'm gonna give a shout out to your cousin Maryam Yemich, who's the whole
Yes,
leader of the whole, Circassian, awakening in the Lebanese community. Great
yes,
lady. I had the very fortunate pleasure to meet her. She came and visited us in the United States before we decided to have a pandemic and riots.
right.
And she's doing a lot of good work, and if there's anybody who I think should take the responsibility of recreating this community, is there. I think the biggest challenge for Lebanese Circassians is the biggest problem is that the term everybody wants to be Circassian. I have to make this joke all the time because somebody will go on their ancestry.com, find out that their great grandmother's, neighbor's mailman's son's pet goldfish
Yep.
was like Circassian.
Yep.
And because of that, they're gonna be like, "Oh, I'm as Circassian as the great Narts of the time." And if you were to bring that to someone, and like like me or someone from our community, say, and you tell that to them, they're not gonna really be as accepting towards it, especially if they're very assimilated. So the most important thing I think that the Lebanese community should really if there's anything that they should do, is that as much as it's difficult, they need to find documentation and proof mostly of where they come from. They need to have proof of their lineage as where as where they're from, and then this way this can help them get readjusted. Otherwise, if you start bringing about that I'm a part mamluk from like, 1500,
Yeah.
at that point I might as well start saying I'm related to like the King of England or something.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. And yeah, you're right. There is this desire from many people to kind of claim that they're Sharkasi. It's a very interesting phenomenon, honestly, and I've noticed it amongst many people. But you're right. Is there any, now that I think about it, is there any Yamaks that you've come across that are in the homeland itself in the
Sure, but
Caucasus?
they're not called Yamaks. Yamak is the Arabic term for it. They're
Right.
called Yamich.
Yamich.
Yamich is the name, and Yamich people, I think they're a Bjadog tribe. So the Circass, for those who are listening again, there's 12 Circassian tribes. Six of them, one was completely purged and extinct, called the Wubuk people. The rest ended up being destroyed and just mixing with the other tribes. So the top Circassian tribes that you hear of today are Qabardays, the biggest one, which is where my father is from, the Shapsols, the Bjadols, the Chamguis, and Hatuqais and a few others. But those are the ones most people often hear of. And I think the Yamich are a Bjadol tribe. I don't think they're Abzak, but this is the tribe they come from. They're found mostly in the Republic of Adigia, where the capital city of Maikop is. And there are a few people, from that clan who live there.
Interesting. That's definitely something worth looking into. I'm gonna be reaching out to Mariam and seeing if
If they
my
if
cousins.
if if someone knows it, Mariam has to know it.
Yeah. I'll reach out to her. Finally, Better, I wanted to ask you. Honestly, this has been great, great episode, and I'm very happy to have you on.
I'm happy to be here. I honestly talk to too many Circassians. I often tell my people, like, listen,
Yeah,
I know how great Circassians are, but the people need to know who we
it's
are.
true.
So,
This is true.
to all those who listen again, shout out, follow me on Instagram, go on Facebook, read about
Yes.
us, talk to us. We're very friendly, open people. So, we, w- I live to do these type of things.
Yes, and this is what I wanted to kind of conclude with this last question, but you've already kind of beat me to it. I wanted to ask you, do you have any resources you'd recommend for people, like especially my audience and people listening to the Tripolitan? Any resources, books, even documentaries that you'd recommend that they could, if they wanted to learn more about the Circassian people?
Sure, absolutely. I think the first one is honestly, Google and Wikipedia are your friends. It's not, the most in depth, but if you want like a good general understanding of who we are and where we come from, the Circassians who contributed to writing those articles online are a huge boost. So you could definitely find a lot of written sources there. In terms of books, there's a few books written in English, also translated into Arabic, that explain Circassian history, the most famous being the late Amjad Jamahwa Allah Yarhamu's book on Circassian history. For those who don't know, Amjad Jamahwa was one of Jordan's most finest and most prominent Circassian historians in the region. He had a page called Circassian Culture and Folklore on Facebook, which shared lots of content on Circassian people. In fact, he even had a YouTube channel where he would subtitle and translate Circassian songs and history pieces. And there's also documentaries done by Al Jazeera about the Circassian community of Jordan, as well as a few others, both in Arabic and in English. The most famous and most inspiring man to me was Qadir Natho, or Nato, Kadirnatho, Qadir Nato. He wrote many, many books on Circassian culture from the United States, and he has two books I think that'd be of interest to people. Would be his first is Circassian History. You can find it in Barnes and Nobles or Amazon, and the first is called Adiga Khabsa. So, before last thing I do want to say is this: you'll often hear the word Adiga among Circassians. You see, in English, we're all Circassian. In Arabic, we're Sharkas. But when I talk to another person of my culture, I say I am Adiga. And that's where the word Adiga comes from. And we call ourselves as Adiga people. And from that, we have a tradition called the Khabza, which is the whole again, that's another podcast alone, what Adiga Khabza is, but it's the traditions and way of life of Circassian people. And Qadir has a great book about it in English called Adiga Khabza, Adyghe, Khabza, Khabze. And again, you can go online, go on Amazon, go on Barnes and Nobles, order your copy, and learn about the traditions of our people. I also have a podcast called Voice of Circassia. You can find me on YouTube. I just started it much similar to yours, but I have a couple of interviews I've done, and I'm doing some documentaries to showcase to people.
That's great.
Even though my podcasts are conducted in the Circassian language, I subtitled them in four languages, including English, Arabic, Turkish, and Russian.
That's great. So, just I guess one last question. I know I told you I have one last one just for the to learn something about the Circassian language. How do you say hello in Circassian?
Okay, so nowadays, due to Islamic influence, this is the funny Islamic correlation. There's a
Okay.
lot of Islamic, Arabic, and Turkish words that ended up being added to the Circassian language. So, for example, if you say Salaam alaikum to us, we're going to say the same thing back to you. You can say Salam. If there is a true Circassian greeting for a hello, uh, it would probably be we ma. In Western, we would say we ma and in Eastern you would say Fimahwa for, and it just means good day to you.
Okay.
So that's as close I can get. We're very formal people like Arabs.
Yeah, no,
So
that's great. I mean,
that's I guess the best way I can say it.
that's good, man. It's always good to learn a couple of words just in case you do meet up with a Circassian, or you may have a Circassian boss you want to impress with a couple of Circassian words. There's no loss in that.
Honestly, the language is I think the biggest challenge for me to be a Circassian is the fact that our language is dying. Again, due to the forced assimilation policies in Turkey and the Arab world, as well as, the consequences of modern Russia today, the Circassian language has become a lot less spoken now. And my heart and passion is for that language to be preserved. So when people like you who come from old Circassian roots, or when people from the audience who aren't even Circassians at all even learn and care about our language, that's huge for us because when we see other people care, it makes many of our own want to care too. And this is what I really aspire to do, every single day. If people care about the culture and do something to preserve it, then at least I can die knowing happy.
Right, and it's with people like you and hopefully more people that have the same passion. The language will live on, and the Circassian people will live on. And I really want to thank you for all your hard work and your effort regarding all your efforts that you've been doing with respect to the Circassian cause. Thank you for being on the show, Better. Allah يعطيك العافية. Thank you so
والله
much.
بارك الله فيك كتير.
Habibi, Allah يخليك. And I want to thank the audience, the Tripolitan audience, for listening in today. Feel free to leave any questions or comments. And if you have any additional questions about the Circassian people or the Caucasus in general, feel free to reach out to Better and make sure to subscribe to his podcast as well. Better, remind me what the name of your podcast is again.
Voice of Circassia, Circassia. And if that's too much for you, just follow me on Instagram at batterkadkoy, BATTERKADKOY.
Great, sounds good. Thank you all, and have a good day. Salam.